The heavy iron door of the basement incinerator scraped against the soot-caked concrete floor with a grinding, metallic screech that rattled the loose mortar in the red brick walls. Followed by the deep, rhythmic thrum of the diesel burners feeding a continuous stream of fuel into the massive cast-iron firebox. I didn't lift my iron poker from the glowing bed of anthracite coal immediately. I kept the heavy steel rod buried deep within the white-hot embers, my right hand holding the insulated handle tight while the forced air blower roared with a deep, dying turbine whine. Have you ever experienced that sudden, bone-chilling drop in barometric pressure when a late-night transport arrives from the homicide division without a single word of warning from the detectives? Knowing full well that you are locked down in the blind, subterranean sublevel of Chicago Police Headquarters where nobody is supposed to walk after midnight? People always talk about police archives as places of orderly bureaucracy. Quiet, sterile rooms where file cabinets store paperwork and evidence is catalogued with respectful detachment before being filed away for trial. They imagine orderly hallways, bright fluorescent lights, and the reassuring presence of desk sergeants managing the transition from crime to justice. They do not know the unnatural, suffocating dread of working in a basement furnace room where footsteps overhead sound muffled and distant, and the air smells permanently of coal dust, diesel exhaust, and scorched grease. They do not know what it feels like when your heart hammers against your ribs because you can hear the heavy rubber wheels of an evidence cart rolling across the concrete floor upstairs. Even though the shift log explicitly stated no more burn orders were scheduled until dawn. I slowly pulled the heavy poker out of the firebox, pushed my wooden stool back with a soft scrape, and stood up from the sorting table, my joints cracking in the heavy, humid heat of the room. The wooden table in front of me was stained with decades of dark, dried blood rings, industrial solvent spills, and ash. Resting on a cracked metal tray beside my elbow were my tools, a heavy leather sorting paddle, a pair of asbestos-lined gauntlets, and a notched steel clipboard holding tonight's destruction manifests. The hallway outside the incinerator bay was pitch black. Only a fresh, white-bordered evidence crate rested squarely on top of the stainless steel staging table, held down by a heavy brass padlock stamped with an active case number. Think about how much confidence we place in our physical barriers and municipal routines. Believing that as long as we keep ourselves locked inside a building guarded by city ordinances, the raw violence of the streets cannot invade our private workspaces. We lock our basement doors, we punch our time cards, and we tell ourselves that the blood-soaked evidence brought down the elevator shaft is just municipal waste. Items to be reduced, scorched, and forgotten by morning. We believe that fire and heat are enough to wrap up human suffering into neat, sanitary packages of ash that can be hauled away by county trucks before the sun comes up. Then an unscheduled evidence crate lands on your table without a supervisor's signature to explain who pushed the cart down. And you realize your furnace room is just a waiting room for things that refuse to stay dead in the evidence lockers. I walked slowly across the concrete floor, my boots kicking up fine gray dust from the floorboards, and approached the staging table under the sickly amber glow of the hanging wire lamp. The wooden crate was splintered at the corners, smelling sharply of copper, dried sweat, and old floor wax. The typed evidence tag pinned to the lid read simply, Evidence Locker 4B, Homicide, Unclaimed Effects, Case #82-9904, Destruct Order Mandatory. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would remain steady if you walked over to an evidence crate at 3 in the morning and saw the blood-stiffened garments waiting for your furnace? We are all just temporary keepers feeding an engine that never stops burning. I set the tag down, turned back toward the roaring iron gate of the incinerator in the center of the room, and pulled my heavy canvas work gloves tightly over my wrists. Preparing to make the first pass through the hottest shift of the night. The heavy metal table groaned under the weight of the evidence crate as I dragged it closer to the mouth of the diesel furnace. A thick, suffocating wave of copper, old sweat, and stale blood washed over me, instantly coating the back of my throat with a dry, metallic taste. Have you ever experienced that sudden, sickening contraction of the chest when an evidence box is unsealed and the ambient air in the room turns heavy with the unmistakable stench of a violent death. People always talk about murder investigations in abstract terms, courtroom testimonies, ballistic reports, and clean evidence bags in police lockers. They imagine sterile polyethylene, white gloves, and objective detachment. They do not know the grotesque reality of personal effects stripped straight from a fresh homicide scene before the blood has even fully oxidized. They do not know what it feels like when the wooden lid is pried open to reveal fabric stiffened into rigid armor by dark, crusty blood, torn jacket sleeves, and items that still carry the silent echo of panic. I reached out with my gloved hand and flicked open the rusted latch of the crate, bringing the harsh, yellow glare of the furnace light down upon the contents. The items inside bore the silent, brutal signatures of a frenzied attack. A heavy wool winter jacket, slashed clean across the chest and heavily matted with dark, coagulated blood. A pair of notched hunting knives wrapped in greasy brown paper, their steel blades dulled by dried organic matter. And resting at the very bottom of the crate, half buried under a pile of shredded cotton rags, was an old, heavy silver pocket watch. Its crystal face was cracked into a spiderweb of fine fractures, yet through the glass, its second hand was still actively, steadily ticking away in the dark. Tick, tick, tick. Think about how desperately we rely on inanimate objects to anchor us in the living world, believing that a watch, a ring, or a piece of clothing remains a neutral, harmless possession after its owner is gone. We catalog them, we tag them with case numbers, and we tell ourselves that closing an evidence file puts an end to the story. We believe that as long as we keep our furnaces roaring, the trauma of the streets can be melted down into harmless clinkers of slag and ash. Then an object from a crime scene starts keeping its own time inside a locked basement, and you realize the belongings of the dead hold on to their energy long after the pulse has stopped. I forced my lungs to draw in another breath, fighting down the sudden wave of vertigo, and reached down to pull the blood-soaked wool jacket out of the crate. The municipal detectives upstairs had already completed their analysis days ago, harvesting fibers, matching blade widths, and filling out the destruction manifests required by the department. Leaving behind a box of personal wreckage that nobody came to claim from the precinct basement. My job wasn't to investigate or question. My job was to erase the evidence. To feed the furnace until every fiber, every blade, and every drop of biological trace was reduced to microscopic carbon floating out the municipal smokestacks. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep holding a blood-stiffened jacket if you knew the fabric was about to fight back against the fire? We are all just temporary keepers feeding an engine that never stops burning. As I hoisted the heavy wool garment toward the yawning, red-hot mouth of the incinerator gate, the steady ticking of the silver pocket watch inside the crate suddenly skipped a beat, followed by a sharp, resonant metallic snap. The heavy iron door of the incinerator swung open on its greased counterweights with a deep, subterranean groan that vibrated straight up through the soles of my boots. A wall of blistering, furnace-white heat rushed out from the chamber, instantly scorching the hairs on the back of my hands and filling the room with the dry, sulphurous roar of burning diesel atomizers. Have you ever experienced that hyper-focused terror when you open a high-temperature industrial firebox and realize the flames inside are behaving with an unnatural, hungry volatility? People always talk about fire as a predictable tool, a chemical reaction of combustion used to warm homes, clear land, or safely destroy refuse in controlled municipal systems. They imagine that flames obey the laws of physics, consuming fuel at steady rates based on oxygen supply in calorific valve. They do not know the skin-crawling panic of standing in front of a cast-iron incinerator where the fire inside seems to lean toward the open door like a living animal smelling fresh meat. They do not know what it feels like when your own face is baked by a heat so intense it feels like a physical hand pressing against your skin, warning you not to step any closer. I gripped the blood-stiffened wool jacket tighter in my asbestos-lined gauntlets and swung my arms to heave the garment directly into the center of the roaring grate. It didn't land with the heavy, dead thud of dry fabric hitting coal. Instead, the moment the hem of the jacket crossed the threshold of the iron door, the white-hot flames inside the chamber seemed to snap forward like reaching fingers. The fire didn't just catch the wool. It swallowed it whole. Within a fraction of a second, the heavy winter coat vanished into the blinding glare of the furnace, accompanied by a sudden, violent sucking sound as if the air pressure inside the room had inverted. And rising from the smokestack exhaust pipe overhead was a thick, oily plume of pitch-black smoke that smelled nothing like burning wool or synthetic thread. It smelled intensely, unmistakably of scorched human hair and sizzling, over-roasted meat. Think about how deeply we invest our trust in industrial destruction, believing that fire is an absolute eraser that reduces complex human tragedies to clean, sterile piles of gray powder. We throw our evidence into the flames, we slam the heavy iron door, and we tell ourselves that heat cleanses the record of everything that happened on the dark streets outside. We believe that as long as the smokestack keeps venting, the past is successfully wiped clean. Then a jacket doesn't burn, it is consumed with a smell that stays lodged in your sinuses for days, and you realize the fire isn't destroying the evidence, it's digesting it. I stumbled backward a half-step, my boots skidding across the cold dust, coughing violently behind my canvas collar as the thick, greasy odor filled the small basement room. My eyes watered from the acrid fumes, stinging sharply under the harsh glare of the wire lamp. I reached for my iron poker to push the unburned remnants deeper into the grate, but my hand froze above the metal tray as a low, muffled sound echoed from deep within the sealed iron bowels of the furnace. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would hold an iron poker if the firebox started making sounds that no mechanical engine on Earth should ever produce? We are all just temporary keepers feeding an engine that never stops burning. As I stared fixedly at the heavy iron door, the diesel burner sputtered once, dropped in pitch, and then settled into a low, rumbling groan that sounded uncomfortably like a human throat clearing itself in the dark. The rumbling groan died away into the steady, mechanical roar of the forced air blower, leaving my ears ringing with a sharp, high-pitched whine. I stood frozen beside the sorting table, my breathing shallow, my fingers twitching inside the heavy canvas gauntlets as I stared at the sealed black iron door of the furnace. Have you ever experienced that absolute, blood-freezing shock when an inanimate industrial machine begins to emit sounds that suggest something organic and suffering is trapped inside its core? People always talk about machinery breaking down with mechanical logic, belts snapping, bearings seizing up, or fuel injectors clogging with carbon residue. They imagine that a furnace is nothing more than brick, cast iron, and fire, devoid of any voice or intention. They do not know the paralyzing horror of standing alone in a subterranean police basement at 3 in the morning and hearing a muffled, rattling intake of breath rise directly out of a burning fuel box. They do not know what it feels like when the rhythmic hum of a diesel blower suddenly harmonizes with a sound that is unmistakably human. I forced myself to take a step closer to the incinerator, my boots crunching over stray pieces of anthracite coal scattered across the floor. The heat radiating from the red brick masonry was blistering, baking the skin of my face through my sweat, but I couldn't pull my eyes away from the seams of the heavy iron door. A thin, dark wisp of smoke was curling out from around the asbestos gasket, not the clean, gray smoke of coal ash, but a heavy, yellowish-brown vapor that twisted into erratic shapes before dissolving into the air. And then it came again. A low, vibrating moan, muffled heavily by thick layers of firebrick and iron, but carrying a distinct, agonizing pitch that clawed straight down my spine. It wasn't a mechanical groan. It was a voice trying to push its way up through a throat filled with smoke and fire. Think about how stubbornly we cling to the comfort of municipal routine, believing that a job like running an evidence incinerator is just manual labor devoid of moral weight or supernatural consequence. We shovel the coal, we burn the clothes, and we tell ourselves we are just good public servants keeping the department basements clean and organized. We believe that as long as we don't ask whose clothes we are burning, we remain completely detached from the violence that put them there. Then a voice calls out from inside the firebox, and you realize you aren't a sanitation worker at all, you are an executioner tending an underground pyre. The hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up as a soft, rhythmic scratching sound began to scrape against the inside of the heavy iron door. Scritch, scritch, thud. It sounded like fingernails dragging across rough cast iron, searching desperately for a latch that only opened from the outside. My stomach churned violently, a hot wave of acid rising into my throat as I stared at the massive iron locking wheel mounted on the front of the furnace door. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would stay steady if an iron door in a locked basement started being beaten from the inside by something that was supposed to be reduced to ash? We are all just temporary keepers feeding an engine that never stops burning. As I reached out a trembling hand toward the iron will to check if the seal was fully engaged, a sharp, violent shockwave blasted against the inside of the door, making the heavy metal plate bulge outward by a fraction of an inch. The heavy iron door of the incinerator shuddered violently under the sudden internal impact, sending a sharp, metallic clang ringing through the hollow masonry of the basement. I yanked my hand back as if I had touched a live electrical wire, stumbling backward until my spine hit the edge of the evidence sorting table. Have you ever experienced that deeply disorienting terror when solid steel and brick begin to flex and warp under a pressure that defies every law of thermodynamics and material science? People always talk about metal as a rigid, unyielding substance, something that requires thousands of degrees of controlled forge heat to bend, shape, or alter. They imagine that an industrial firebox is an absolute container, holding its contents securely within walls of solid cast iron and refractory firebrick. They do not know the suffocating, claustrophobic nightmare of watching a 3-inch thick iron door bow outward under a force pushing from the empty, burning interior. They do not know what it feels like when physical barriers lose their integrity, and the boundary between the fire and the room begins to collapse. I stared in paralyzed disbelief as the center of the black iron door warped slightly outward, glowing with a dull, cherry-red heat from the raging diesel flames behind it. And then, right across the blistering surface of the metal, a dark, sickening mark began to take shape. It wasn't a burn blister or a flake of rust. It was the distinct, wet impression of a human hand, fingers splayed wide, palm pressed flat against the glowing interior of the iron plate, leaving a dark, sizzling smudge of blackened blood and grease that hissed loudly as it boiled away against the metal. HSSSS. Asterisk. The imprint shifted slightly, the fingers curling into a desperate claw as if the hand inside was sliding down the hot iron in a final, agonizing struggle to find purchase. Think about how deeply we trust the mechanical security of our workspaces, believing that heavy bolts, thick walls, and locked doors are enough to keep the horrors of our work safely contained. We lock our equipment, we seal our vaults, and we tell ourselves that whatever happens inside an industrial machine stays strictly governed by mechanical engineering. We believe that physical matter cannot defy the laws of the furnace. Then a bloody handprint burns itself onto the outside of a sealed firebox from the inside, and you realize your machinery is possessed by something that refuses to burn away. Before my brain could process the impossibility of what I was seeing, a second handprint slammed against the iron door right beside the first, accompanied by a muffled, guttural shriek that rattled the wire guard of the overhead lamp. Bang! The sound was deafening, echoing off the low concrete ceiling like a gunshot fired inside a concrete bunker. A thick cloud of acrid, gray smoke billowed out from around the warped edges of the door gasket, carrying with it the unbearable, sickening stench of scorched flesh and boiling copper. My legs went weak under me, and I slid down the side of the wooden sorting table until I was sitting flat on the dusty concrete floor, clutching my head in my hands. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would stay clean if you sat in the dark watching blood boil on the outside of a furnace door? We are all just temporary keepers feeding an engine that never stops burning. As I cowered on the floor, listening to the frantic, muffled beating against the iron plate, the cracked silver pocket watch sitting on the sorting table beside me suddenly gave a violent twitch and leaped off the wood. The heavy silver pocket watch hit the concrete floor with a sharp, metallic clatter just inches from my boots, sending its cracked crystal face shattering into a dozen glittering pieces across the dust. Yet, despite the shattered glass and the heavy fall, it didn't stop. In fact, it accelerated. Have you ever experienced that blinding, nauseating shock of the surreal when an ordinary mechanical timekeeper breaks every rule of physics and starts spinning its gears like a living heart in a panic? People always talk about clocks as steady, reassuring symbols of order, steady ticks measuring out the minutes, hours, and days with calm, mathematical precision. They imagine that time is an unchangeable constant, moving forward at a fixed, predictable pace that nothing can alter or speed up. They do not know the helpless, dizzying horror of watching a pocket watch shatter on a basement floor and hearing its internal mechanism spin into a frantic, hypervelocity whir. They do not know what it feels like when an object from a crime scene starts racing through time on its own, dragging the entire room into a distorted reality where seconds feel like hours. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees across the gritty floor, my eyes locked on the silver casing twitching violently among the coal dust. The second hand wasn't ticking anymore, it was whirling around the cracked dial in a dizzying blur, creating a high-pitched, whirring buzz that sounded like an angry hornet trapped inside a tin can. Bzzzzzzzzzt. And with every spin of the frantic hand, the heat radiating from the massive iron incinerator door spiked dramatically, turning the air in the basement into a thick, dry oven that scorched the inside of my lungs with every inhalation. The bloody handprints burned onto the metal door began to bubble and steam, turning from black to bright, glowing crimson as if fresh blood was being continuously pumped against the steel from within. Think about how arrogant we become in our daily routines, believing that our time belongs to us, that our schedules are secure, and that the hours of the night will pass safely until the morning shift relieves us. We check our watches, we punch our time cards, and we tell ourselves that the night is just a passage of routine hours waiting for the dawn. We believe we control the pace of our labor. Then a shattered pocket watch starts spinning out of control on the floor, and you realize time in the basement isn't measuring your shift, it's counting down to something terrible. With a sudden, violent snap, the winding stem of the pocket watch sheared completely off the silver case. The spinning hands locked instantly into a fixed, impossible position, pointing straight down with unwavering precision. At the exact same second, the muffled screaming and beating against the heavy iron furnace door stopped dead. Absolute, suffocating silence slammed over the basement room, heavier and more oppressive than the noise had ever been. Not a single gear whined. Not a single diesel atomizer hissed. Even the forced air blower seemed to hold its breath inside the brick housing. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would stay steady if a room went dead silent right after a clock stopped spinning? We are all just temporary keepers feeding an engine that never stops burning. Before I could even push myself up from the concrete floor, a low, ominous hiss hissed from the base of the incinerator, followed by a sudden, blinding flash of pure scarlet light that shot out from beneath the warped iron door. A blinding tongue of brilliant scarlet flame shot out from the bottom seal of the iron incinerator door, racing across the concrete floor like a living river of liquid fire. Whoosh! The crimson blaze didn't burn upward toward the ceiling, it spread flat across the dust and coal residue, forming a wide, glowing perimeter that instantly encircled the sorting table, the evidence crate, and the spot where I cowered on the floor. Have you ever experienced that absolute, crushing despair when you realize the fire hasn't just escaped its container, it has deliberately mapped out a trap to cut off your only path of escape? People always talk about fires as mindless disasters, random, chaotic consumption of fuel driven by draft and wind with no intent or direction. They imagine that as long as you keep a clear path to the exit door, you can simply run away from the danger. They do not know the suffocating terror of watching flames crawl across a floor with calculated precision, sealing off the heavy steel exit door with a wall of blistering, impassable heat. They do not know what it feels like when the architecture of a room itself turns against you, transforming a basement workspace into a ringed arena designed to hold you with whatever is burning in the dark. I scrambled backward until my shoulders pressed hard against the cold, damp limestone blocks of the back wall, lifting my boots away from the creeping edge of the crimson flames. The heat was staggering, baking my skin and turning the air into a shimmering, distorted mirage. Across the room, the massive iron furnace door gave a long, slow, agonizing groan as its warped hinges finally gave way under the immense internal pressure. Creak, snap. The heavy iron door didn't just swing open, it was violently blown outward off its mountings, crashing onto the concrete floor with a deafening, earth-shaking shock that sent a shower of sparks flying in every direction. Think about how much energy we waste trying to protect our physical forms, believing that a secure job, a concrete building, and thick walls are permanent shields against the violence of the world. We run, we hide, we guard our safety, and we tell ourselves we are invincible as long as we stay inside our designated stations. We believe that survival is simply a matter of keeping your head down and following orders. Then an iron furnace door blows off its hinges in a locked basement, and you realize how fragile, fleeting, and trapped a human life really is when the fire decides to come out. From the dark, yawning cavity of the opened incinerator, no ashes tumbled out onto the floor. Instead, a thick, billowing cloud of gray, choking smoke poured over the lip of the firebox, swirling into towering, humanoid shapes that writhed and twisted in the center of the room. The smoke didn't dissipate into the ventilation system. It gathered itself into dense, shifting masses that carried the distinct, haunting outlines of arms, torsos, and featureless faces, all turning their hollow, smoky gazes directly toward where I was huddled against the wall. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep shaking if a cloud of smoke shaped like a dozen burning victims rose out of a furnace to look at you? We are all just temporary keepers feeding an engine that never stops burning. As the smoky figures drifted slowly across the glowing ring of fire toward my corner, the shattered silver pocket watch on the floor between us began to glow with an intense, internal red light. The drifting masses of gray, churning smoke moved closer across the concrete floor, gliding silently over the ring of crimson flames as if the heat meant nothing to them at all. Every wave of the smoke brought an overwhelming, stomach-churning wave of the smell, not just burning wool or old clothes, but the unmistakable, sickeningly sweet stench of roasting human skin, scorched hair, and bubbling fat. Have you ever experienced that hypersensory paralysis where every terrifying detail, the shifting smoke, the sweet smell of burnt flesh, the glowing floor, becomes magnified 1,000 times until it fills your entire universe? People always talk about high-stress moments as bursts of high-speed action where people fight back, throw punches, or leap out of danger with superhuman energy. They imagine that courage is a natural, automatic reflex that kicks in when the absolute worst happens. They do not know the deadening weight of absolute terror that nails your boots to the floor, freezes your blood, and robs your limbs of all coordination. They do not know what it feels like when your breath catches in your throat, turning every heartbeat into a heavy, suffocating hammer blow against your ribs while a wall of smoke closes in on your hiding spot. I pressed my back harder into the rough limestone blocks of the wall, my fingers clawing uselessly at the cold stone as I tried to melt right through the masonry. The smoky figures stopped just a few feet away from where I cowered on the floor. They didn't have mouths, but as they hovered in the superheated air, a chorus of overlapping, whispered voices began to vibrate directly inside my skull. We were logged in as property, we were marked for disposal, we were burned before the trial. The whispers hissed softly through the roar of the diesel burners, carrying an unbearable weight of rage, betrayal, and unredressed violence that made my vision blur with hot tears. Think about how deeply we attach ourselves to our professional duties, our paperwork, and the small markers of institutional authority we wear to prove we belong to the system. We log our cases, we stamp our manifests, and we tell ourselves that our jobs are just administrative tasks that keep society clean and functional. We believe that as long as we follow the rules of the precinct, we are protected by the badge and the uniform. Then the victims of the cases you burned stand before you in the dark, and you realize the system you served was never designed to protect the innocent, it was designed to make their disappearance easier to sweep into a furnace. One of the towering smoke figures reached out a long, amorphous arm, extending a hand made of swirling, gray soot right toward my chest. It didn't touch my shirt. Instead, it hovered just an inch above my sternum, sending a freezing, numbing cold radiating straight through my heavy canvas work shirt and deep into my heart, contrasting violently with the blistering heat of the basement. "You fed the fire, Keeper," the collective whisper echoed inside my mind, cold and sharp as broken glass. Asterisk, now the fire needs more fuel to finish the shift. Asterisk. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep trembling if a ghost made of precinct smoke touched your chest and reminded you of every box you ever burned? We are all just temporary keepers feeding an engine that never stops burning. Before I could gasp for air, the smoky figure swept backward toward the open maw of the iron incinerator, gesturing urgently toward the gaping, empty firebox with a long, ash-gray arm. The swirling masses of gray smoke drifted back across the glowing ring of crimson flames, gathering in a dense, roiling cloud right above the open, blackened mouth of the iron incinerator. The diesel burners inside the firebox sputtered, flared, and then settled into a deep, vibrating hum that echoed off the damp brick walls like an invitation. Have you ever experienced that surreal disbelief when a terrifying encounter suddenly shifts direction, offering you a choice that feels entirely impossible yet completely inevitable? People always talk about life or death moments as desperate fights for survival where you either win or lose against an attacker. They imagine that threats are always external enemies trying to tear you apart in a blind rage. They do not know the chilling disorientation of standing before an open furnace while the spirits of the burned simply wait for you to step across the threshold and take your place on the grate. They do not know what it feels like when your life's labor, every shift worked, every box burned, every piece of evidence reduced to ash, demands its final settlement. I pushed myself up slowly from the dusty concrete floor, leaning heavily against the limestone wall for physical support, my boots trembling as I tried to find my balance against the oppressive heat. My work shirt was soaked entirely through with cold, terrified sweat, sticking uncomfortably to my back. The smoky figures stood motionless in front of the firebox, their hollow, featureless forms silhouetted against the blinding white-hot glare of the refractory bricks inside the open chamber. None of them moved to grab me. None of them lashed out with violence. They simply watched me with an infinite, heavy patience, waiting to see what an evidence incinerator keeper does when the evidence starts demanding an accounting from the man holding the poker. Think about how stubbornly we cling to the illusion that our labor is just a neutral job, believing that the things we destroy in the dark leave no trace on our own souls. We burn the clothes, we sweep the ash, and we tell ourselves our hands remain clean because we wore thick canvas gloves. We believe we are just anonymous functionaries in a vast municipal machine. Then the machine breaks down, the fire opens its doors, and you realize every scrap of evidence you ever fed into the flames was just a rehearsal for your own disposal. I looked down at the floor between my boots. The shattered silver pocket watch lay quietly in the cold dust, its broken hands resting permanently on the dial, no longer ticking, no longer spinning, just resting in the ashes like a finished ledger. And beside it lay my heavy iron poker, its tip glowing with a dull, residual cherry-red heat that pulsed in time with my own racing pulse. The air in the basement grew heavier, the oxygen thinning out as the roiling cloud of smoke inside the furnace began to spin into a wide, cyclonic vortex that pulled every loose scrap of paper, dust, and coal ember toward the open iron mouth. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep working if the wind in your room started pulling everything you own straight toward an open fire? We are all just temporary keepers feeding an engine that never stops burning. As the vortex grew stronger, the remaining unburned evidence crate on the sorting table began to slide across the wood, tipping over the edge and spilling its remaining contents, a stack of bloody receipts, a torn silver chain, and a second pocket watch, directly into the path of the fiery draft. The evidence crate on the sorting table tipped completely over, sending a cascade of forgotten case files, blood-stained garments, and rusted trinkets spilling across the wood and tumbling down onto the concrete floor. The cyclonic vortex inside the incinerator roared to life, catching the loose papers and fabric scraps mid-air and spinning them into a chaotic, whirling funnel of burning paper and ash. Have you ever experienced that sudden spike of frantic panic when years of hidden records, buried secrets, and forgotten evidence are violently ripped out of their boxes and thrown into the open air? People always talk about institutional archives as permanent, secure vaults where the past is safely locked away behind steel doors and catalog numbers. They imagine that paperwork is an unshakable wall protecting society from the chaos of unsolved crimes. They do not know the crushing dread of watching an entire room's worth of suppressed evidence get sucked into an inferno, revealing every name, every date, and every suppressed detail you were hired to make disappear. They do not know what it feels like when the precinct's darkest secrets begin swirling around your head like a storm of burning confetti. I threw my arms up over my face to protect my eyes from the flying debris as municipal case files, stamped confidential, unsolved, destroyed, whirled past in flashes of scorching flame and black ink. Names and dates flashed across the glowing pages before turning instantly to crisp, black flakes of carbon. Jane Doe, 1981, Alley 4. Unknown male, 1982, Warehouse District. Unclaimed evidence, case hashtag 82-8812. The entire history of the basement incinerator was being dragged out of its dark corners, hauled into the open, and fed directly into the roaring mouth of the firebox in a final, uncontrollable purge. Think about how much faith we place in the physical security of our administrative systems, believing that burning evidence is enough to bury the truth forever. We feed the furnace, we file the destruction certificates, and we tell ourselves that whatever goes into the fire ceases to exist in the world. We believe that institutional power is defined by what it can permanently erase. Then the burned records rise up from the ashes in a fiery whirlwind, and you realize nothing is ever truly destroyed, it is only stored in the heat until someone comes to collect the debt. With a deafening roar, the vortex inside the incinerator expanded, sending a massive wave of superheated air sweeping across the entire basement room. The remaining crates on the shelves cracked and splintered under the pressure, spilling their contents into the fiery draft. And right in the center of the swirling storm of burning paper and smoke, the towering smoky figures raised their ash-gray arms toward the ceiling, letting out a unified, roaring shriek that shattered every remaining light bulb in the basement in a single instant. Asterisk pop. Pop. Pop, asterisk. Total, absolute darkness crashed over the room, illuminated only by the blinding, pulsating glare of the open incinerator firebox at the far end of the hall. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would hold a work order if every light in your building shattered at once and left you alone with the fire? We are all just temporary keepers feeding an engine that never stops burning. As the sparks rained down like a storm of falling stars, the heavy iron sorting table behind me gave a loud, groaning shriek and began to slide across the floor directly toward the open mouth of the furnace. The heavy wooden sorting table scraped across the concrete floor with a long, agonizing screech, its iron-reinforced legs dragging a trail of sparks as it slid directly toward the open, roaring mouth of the incinerator. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, my boots slipping on the slick, ash-covered stone, desperately trying to put distance between myself and the advancing mass of burning wood and iron. Have you ever experienced that complete, paralyzing disorientation when the solid furniture of your room turns into a moving conveyor belt carrying you straight toward a fiery doom? People always talk about workspaces as stable, stationary domains, desks, tables, and equipment anchored firmly to the floor where you can always find your footing. They imagine that heavy oak and iron are immovable objects that obey the laws of gravity and architecture. They do not know the terrifying reality of standing in a room where the floor itself seems to tilt toward the fire, and your own workbench becomes the sled that slides you into the grate. They do not know what it feels like when the air turns so thick and hot that every breath feels like inhaling liquid glass, and the distance between you and the exit door grows impossibly wide. The sorting table slammed hard against the brick foundation of the incinerator with a deafening crash, splintering its wooden top and sending my tray of tools flying into the blinding white-hot interior of the firebox. I hit the floor hard, my breath knocked completely out of my lungs, coughing violently as the thick, sweet-smelling smoke billowed over my head. I raised my eyes, my vision swimming through the shimmering heat mirage. The smoky figures stood in a wide circle around the base of the incinerator, their formless silhouettes glowing with an eerie, internal luminescence against the darkness of the ruined basement. No path remained to the exit door. The ring of crimson flames had widened, sealing off every corner of the room with a solid wall of intense, roaring fire. Think about how desperately we cling to our illusions of control, believing that as long as we work hard, follow the rules, and keep our heads down, we can outlast any shift or survive any crisis. We bargain with our time, we trade our labor for wages, and we tell ourselves we can walk away when the job is done. We believe that our existence belongs entirely to us until the very end. Then you find yourself cornered in a basement by the ghosts of everything you burned, and you realize the shift never ends, it only claims its final keeper. I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, my muscles trembling violently, the skin of my face radiating a dull, searing pain from the blistering heat of the open firebox. One of the towering smoky figures stepped forward, gliding silently across the ash-covered floor until it stood directly above me. It didn't look down with eyes, for it had none. Yet its heavy, oppressive presence filled my entire mind with an undeniable, absolute command. The firebox is cold no longer, keeper, the collective whisper echoed through my skull, vibrating against my teeth with the force of a hammer blow. Asterisk, climb up and finish the record. Asterisk. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep holding onto the floor if a ghost invited you to step inside the incinerator you fed for years? We are all just temporary keepers feeding an engine that never stops burning. As I struggled to lift my weight off the floor, the heavy iron poker, still glowing with a dull, residual heat, rolled across the concrete and bumped softly against the toe of my right boot, as if offering one final, useless tool for a fight that could never be won. The heavy iron poker rolled against my boot, its dull red glow pulsing in the darkness like a dying ember refusing to go out entirely. I didn't pick it up. I didn't try to fight the heat, or run toward the blocked exit door, or scream for help that would never reach the street above the police precinct. Have you ever experienced that profound, unshakable peace that comes when you finally stop running from an inevitable end and simply surrender to the fire that has consumed your entire life? People always talk about the final moments of existence as a desperate, frantic struggle, fighting for air, clawing at closed doors, and screaming against the dark. They imagine that fear is the master of every ending, driving us to kick against the current until our strength gives out. They do not know the heavy, comforting weight that settles over your bones when you realize the evidence was never the victims, it was the system, the furnace, and the keeper all along. They do not know what it feels like when the chaos of the world dissolves into complete silence, leaving nothing behind except the steady, rhythmic roar of an engine burning through its last piece of fuel. I stood up slowly on shaking legs, my boots crunching over the broken glass of the shattered pocket watch scattered across the ash-covered concrete floor. The ring of crimson flames parted just enough to clear a narrow path straight to the threshold of the open incinerator door. The smoky figures stepped back, forming an aisle of silent, watching witnesses who had waited decades for this exact hour of the morning. I didn't look back toward the stairs leading up to the precinct lobby. There was no shift change coming at dawn. There was no detective waiting to sign off on my logbook. There was only the white-hot glare of the refractory firebrick, humming with the unspent energy of every life, every secret, and every garment I had ever reduced to ash. Think about how much energy we waste trying to outrun our own history, spending our decades sorting, burning, and hiding the wreckage of the world, terrified that someone might check our manifests. We worry about the unwritten reports, the missed incinerations, and the unfinished seams of our duties, believing that if we just work harder, we can delay the final audit. We forget that every keeper eventually steps onto their own grate. And that the fires we spend our lives feeding were never meant to be tended by anyone else. I walked forward through the ring of fire, my boots leaving clean, dark footprints in the fine gray ash covering the floor until I reached the edge of the open iron grate. The heat was absolute, stripping away the air from my lungs and turning my skin to dry parchment in a single breath. I climbed up onto the heavy cast iron bars, feeling the white-hot fury of the anthracite coals glowing fiercely beneath my soles. I turned around, looked out across the dark, ruined basement one last time, and pulled the heavy, warped iron door shut behind me with my own hands. "The records are closed," I whispered into the blinding light as the flames rushed up to meet my chest. "Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers will keep moving before the room goes quiet and the fire stops? We are all just temporary keepers feeding an engine that never stops burning." I closed my eyes, let out my final breath, and left the basement floor to the dark and the ash. The fluorescent tube overhead emitted a low, nauseating drone, accompanied by a high-frequency tremor that made the loose glass casing rattle against its wire guard. The acoustic environment consisted solely of that continuous electrical hum and the monotonous, rhythmic ping of water droplets hitting an iron bucket in the dark corner. I sat hunched over on a broken wooden stool in the absolute center of the subterranean sub-basement, staring blankly at the massive wooden board mounted against the damp limestone wall. The air down here in the mortuary crypt was thick, heavy, and permanently saturated with the sharp, chemical reek of formaldehyde, stagnant cellar moisture, and the sweet, clinging rot of old dust. Have you ever experienced that profound, suffocating isolation that settles over you when you are locked in a windowless concrete room at 2:30 in the morning, miles away from any living soul? People always talk about night shifts as quiet, peaceful interludes where you can read a book, drink hot coffee, and catch up on your thoughts. They imagine that silence is empty, neutral, and harmless. They do not know the agonizing psychological weight of a basement where every square inch of wall space is covered in hundreds of cold, dangling steel keys, each one locking away the personal belongings, vaults, and iron caskets of the dead. They do not know what it feels like when the only auditory companion you have for 6 hours straight is the steady echo of water falling into a metal container in the dark. I reached out with my right hand and adjusted the heavy leather key ring clipped securely to my belt loop, letting my fingers graze the cold iron teeth of the master wards. My job wasn't glamorous. I was Daniel, the night keeper of the board. My entire responsibility consisted of receiving the brass tags, safe deposit tokens, and casket padlocks brought down from the autopsy suites, stamping them with intake numbers, and hanging them neatly from small brass hooks driven into the massive oak board behind my desk. Hundreds of keys. Hundreds of closed stories. Filed away by metal, categorized by date, and left to hang quietly in the dark until the county clerks or surviving families came to claim them. Except tonight, the intake log had been unusually grim. An unmarked transport had arrived from an unsolved accident scene on the edge of the city just an hour ago, carrying a body that the detectives had rushed down the elevator shaft with strict orders to lock away in Vault 12 without filling out the standard paperwork. Think about how blindly we trust our physical systems of containment, believing that as long as we turn a key in an iron lock and hang it on a numbered hook, the chaos of a violent death is successfully neutralized. We file the metal, we close the heavy doors, and we tell ourselves that the dead stay safely contained inside their designated boxes. We believe that a simple brass key is enough to draw a permanent line between the living world and the things that refuse to rest in peace. Then the fluorescent light flickers, the dripping water stops echoing, and you realize the board behind you isn't just a rack for keys, it's a switchboard for everything that wants to get out. I forced my eyes away from the oak board, lifted my thermos of lukewarm black coffee from the edge of the splintered desk, and took a slow, bitter sip. The metallic taste of the drink coated my tongue, matching the chemical tang of the formaldehyde drifting up from the storage vaults in the shadows. My boots rested on the cold, sweat-slicked concrete floor, my muscles aching from the damp cold that seeped right through my thick wool trousers. Nothing moved in the crypt. Just the flickering neon tube overhead, casting long, jittery shadows across the endless rows of hanging brass tags. Then, right from the center of the dark wooden board behind my back, a sharp, distinct metallic snap broke the silence of the room. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would stay steady if a single key on a wall of hundreds decided to drop without a breath of wind to touch it? We are all just temporary keepers tending a wall of locks. I set my thermos down on the desk with a heavy, deliberate thud, my heart giving a sudden, violent lurch against my ribs as I slowly turned my head to face the oak board. The single brass key swayed slightly on its hook, its jagged teeth catching the sickly amber glare of the buzzing neon tube. It hung directly beneath the small, stamped metal plate marked with the number 12. The key belonging to the unclaimed body brought down from the accident scene just an hour ago. Have you ever experienced that sudden, sickening jolt of adrenaline when an inanimate object moves entirely on its own accord, defying every law of gravity and mechanical probability? People always talk about fear as a reaction to sudden violence, a barking dog, a shadow in an alley, or a slammed door. They imagine that danger always announces itself with a loud, aggressive crash. They do not know the quiet, blood-freezing horror of watching a piece of cold metal detach itself from a wall in complete silence and begin to drift downward through the air. They do not know what it feels like when the rigid rules of your daily routine instantly collapse, and you realize something unseen is sharing the room with you. I watched, completely paralyzed, as the old, rusted iron key slipped off its brass hook with a soft, sliding scrape. It didn't drop straight down to the floor. Instead, it hung suspended for a fraction of a second in the heavy, chemical-laden air, turning lazily in slow motion before hitting the concrete floor with a sharp, echoing tap. The acoustic environment at that moment consisted solely of the dull impact of the metal hitting the stone, followed by the faint resonance fading into the damp corners of the crypt. I didn't move. My boots felt glued to the floorboards, my breath caught tight in my throat as I stared down at the small iron key resting among the dust at my feet. And then, before my brain could even begin to process the impossibility of what I had just seen, the entire wall behind me erupted into motion. Think about how desperately we rely on the stability of our environment, believing that heavy walls, bolted fixtures, and orderly rows of objects are permanent features of a rational world. We arrange our tools, we hang our keys, and we tell ourselves that as long as things stay in their assigned places, the world is safe and predictable. We believe that structure protects us from chaos. Then a single falling key triggers a chain reaction across an entire wall, and you realize every single lock in the building is connected to something that is waking up. Every single key on the massive oak board, dozens and dozens of heavy brass tags, iron rings, and steel padlocks, began to spin, swing, and rattle simultaneously. They didn't just sway gently. They thrashed against the wooden backing with frantic, manic velocity, striking the oak board in a deafening, metallic chorus that filled the crypt with a chaotic, screeching din of clashing steel. The acoustic environment was overwhelmed by an overlapping storm of metallic rattling and sharp, repetitive strikes against the oak panels. The vibration of the shaking wall traveled straight down into the legs of my wooden stool, making my entire body shake as I covered my ears with my hands, my eyes wide with terror as I scanned the spinning sea of metal. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would stay clamped over your ears if 100 keys on a wall started screaming in the dark? We are all just temporary keepers tending a wall of locks. As I dropped to my hands and knees to scramble away from the deafening wall, a deep, heavy metallic groan echoed from the far, pitch-black corner of the crypt, originating directly from Vault 12. The heavy iron door of Vault 12, the massive, walk-in cold storage unit tucked away in the darkest corner of the sub-basement, gave a long, agonizing groan as its industrial latch slowly unsealed itself from within. The acoustic environment shifted instantly, replacing the clatter of the keyboard with a low, grinding friction of heavy steel sliding against rusted hinges. Have you ever experienced that absolute, soul-crushing paralysis when a heavy industrial vault door begins to open from the inside, knowing full well that the body locked inside was dead on arrival? People always talk about morgues as secure facilities where locks, steel doors, and refrigeration units ensure that the dead remain strictly where they were placed by the coroner. They imagine that cold storage is an absolute barrier against the biological reality of decay and movement. They do not know the suffocating, claustrophobic terror of standing alone in a subterranean crypt and watching a 300-pound steel vault door swing open under its own power. They do not know what it feels like when the frost pouring out from the interior hits the warm air of the room, carrying the unmistakable, sickening stench of damp earth and old grave soil. I pressed my back hard against the base of my desk, my fingers clawing uselessly at the rough concrete floor as I stared into the yawning black cavity of Vault 12. The heavy insulated door swung wider, bouncing against its reinforced hinges with a dull, heavy thud against the limestone wall. And out from the freezing darkness stepped a figure. He wore the ruined, mud-caked remnants of a heavy winter coat, soaked completely through with stagnant river water and dark, coagulated blood. His skin was the color of curdled milk, stretched tight and bone-white over a skull that seemed slightly too large for his frame. Worst of all were his eyes. There were no pupils, no irises, no moisture, just two hollow sockets packed completely full of dry, gray graveyard dirt that trickled slowly down his sunken cheeks with every heavy, dragging step he took. Think about how deeply we invest our trust in medical certificates and police reports, believing that a body pronounced dead by a doctor is a finished chapter of human biology. We sign the tags, we zip the bags, and we tell ourselves that once a person enters the cold room, their story is permanently over. We believe that death is a quiet, orderly cessation of movement. Then a corpse steps out of a freezing vault with dirt packed into its eyes, and you realize the morgue isn't a final resting place, it's a holding pen. The dead man didn't run. He didn't scream or lunge with predatory fury. He moved with a slow, agonizing deliberation, his heavy boots making a wet, squelching sound against the concrete floor as he walked straight across the crypt toward my desk. The acoustic environment narrowed to the heavy, uneven cadence of his wet footsteps pacing across the stone. Every step he sent out a fresh wave of freezing, subterranean frost washing over my face, carrying a smell so ancient and foul it made my stomach violently heave. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I tried to push myself backward, but my legs were completely numb, locked in place by a terror so profound it felt like solid ice settling in my veins. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep supporting your weight if a corpse walked out of the dark and stared at you with dirt-filled eyes? We are all just temporary keepers tending a wall of locks. As the pale, ruined figure stopped directly beside my wooden stool, his cracked, gray lips parted slightly, and he slowly raised a swollen, mud-caked hand toward my waist. The dead man's cold, stiff fingers bypassed my coat pockets entirely, moving with deliberate precision straight to the heavy steel key ring clipped to my leather belt loop. The massive brass ring holding the master keys of the entire crypt. Have you ever experienced that absolute, crushing realization that you are no longer the keeper of the keys, but just another piece of property waiting to be locked away? People always talk about survival as a fight, a desperate struggle to break free, run up the stairs, and escape into the living world. They imagine that as long as you have legs, you can outrun your fate. They do not know the deadening weight of surrender that takes over when a dead hand wraps around your own keys and loops them upward around your own neck. They do not know what it feels like when the tools of your profession are turned into a garrote, sealing your fate with the very locks you spent years organizing. I tried to gasp for air, but my throat locked tight as the heavy steel chain and the cluster of 100 brass keys were wrenched upward from my belt. The cold metal scraped roughly against the skin of my jaw, wrapping tightly around my windpipe with an unyielding, mechanical force that cut off my breath in a single, brutal jerk. The corpse stood towering over me, his dirt-filled eyes staring down into mine with an infinite, terrifying emptiness. And then, across the room, a series of sharp, mechanical locks engaging broke the silence. The acoustic environment shifted entirely to the heavy clatter of iron bars dropping and deadbolts sliding home. Think about how much confidence we place in our ability to escape the basement, believing that doors can always be opened from the inside as long as you have the right key. We check the exits, we test the handles, and we tell ourselves we can leave whenever our shift is over. We believe that freedom is just a matter of turning a lock. Then every iron door in the sub-basement slams shut by itself, and the heavy deadbolts slide home into their frames with a final, echoing crash that seals the crypt forever. Heavy iron security gates dropped over the stairwell entrance with a resounding crash. The exit doors bolted themselves from the outside, their internal mechanisms locking into place with a definitive, unalterable finality that left no doubt about who owned the building now. I clawed desperately at the heavy key chain digging into my windpipe, my fingernails scraping against cold brass and steel, but the dead man's grip was as immovable as cast iron. The room began to spin, the buzzing neon light overhead fracturing into a million blinding points of white glare before fading slowly into total, velvety darkness. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers will keep reaching for the light once the heavy iron door of the crypt locks from the outside? We are all just temporary keepers tending a wall of locks. I let out one final, silent breath as the key chain tightened completely around my neck, joining the endless rows of silent, hanging metal on the board in the dark.